I would like to open the first session. May I please receive moderator Mr. Rafiq Lata from Energy Intelligence. Just a short note on Mr. Lata. He's a senior energy correspondent for Energy Intelligence, Middle East. He joined EI in 2013, initially covering Iraq, started his career as a journalist, notably worked at the BBC. Welcome, Mr. Lata. Please, may you introduce your panel participants later.
Yeah. It gives me great pleasure to be here. I was here for the first one 2 years ago, and if this is half as good, it will be a good event. It's a lovely location, great participants, and great hospitality, so thank you. Very pleased to have the members of the panelists that I've got at the moment. I believe on Skype we have Sheikh Ali Khalifa al-Sabah, former Minister of Oil in Kuwait, who's been Minister of Oil twice, between 1978 and 83, and 85 and 91, both critical times for OPEC. You've seen a lot during the Iran-Iraq war and many tense times during the region. I'm sure his experience will help us in these times we see ourselves today. He's also been Minister of Finance for Kuwait between 1984 and 85, and is Chairman of the Board of Directors of Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. Welcome, Sheikh Ali, and if I may say, you've got the son of your old friend Ali Al-Artiga, Dr. Ahmed Al-Artiga, on the panel with us today. If you could come up, please. Dr. Latiga has spent over 25 years in investment management, development, finance, private equity research. He is the CEO of Apicor, which is a unique institution, bringing together 10 Arab countries and does lending and also holds stakes in various projects. He comes from before that. He was with the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and the largest global development institution focused on private sector and emerging markets. And he oversaw an investment portfolio of 2.7 million and an advisory program of 200 million. So as far as the remit of investment needs and what's needed for development, we're very fortunate to have him here. Next, if we can go on to Mr. David Hobbs, Dr. David Hobbs, who is a non-resident fellow with Atlantic Council, a Global Energy Centre. Prior to this, he was with CAPSARC, which is a new institution, one of the largest think tanks for energy in the world, based in Riyadh. Very impressive background, and before that he was with IHS Sira and leading their research drive, and we're very fortunate to have him here with us today. And if I could have Mr. Saroj Jah, please. Saroj is with the World Bank. He's the regional director of the Mashriq Department in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Iran. He's been in this position since about July 2017. And Mr. Jah has basically had a lot of experience in difficult areas, conflict, development. So he's ideal for us now in this period. He's worked in Central Asia. He was the senior, prior to joining this particular role, he was the senior director for fragility, conflict and violence global practice of the World Bank Group. And he joined the World Bank in 2005 as a senior infrastructure specialist. Radia Sadawi, if you could come up, please. Radia is the chief of the energy section in the Sustainable Development Policies Division of the UN's Economic Social Commission for West Asia. She's very much a gas expert. Prior to this, she was head of data services and statistics at the Gas Exporters Forum in Doha. And before that, she had several senior roles in Sonatrach in Algeria. So we're very pleased to step to here. And finally, Mr. Hisham al-Makawi, who is the regional president for BP North Africa, who is responsible for all BP's activities in Algeria, Egypt, Libya, and Morocco. And just to be clear, this is a strategic job. Mr. Nakawi, certainly in Algeria and Libya, he runs two of the organizations that are very central for the economies of these countries. And but on the other side of the coin, Algeria and Egypt are pretty strategic for BP. He's had over 25 years of experience at BP, having joined Amoco in Egypt in 1990. And he's held roles in Chicago and London. We haven't got a lot of time, so I'll try and limit my own comments as short as possible. We've been asked to talk about the impact of the new energy map on the region, on the Middle East. Now, as I see it, there's sort of three main drivers of change here, sort of three horsemen of the apocalypse. We're so strapped for time, I've had to kill one. First of all, there's the environment, in the widest sense of the word, of the term. So we're talking about demographics and water challenges, of which we'll hear about later, but primarily climate change. And everywhere we look in the world, people are having to adjust. Non-believers, skeptics, they're all having to adjust for climate change. So this is, central, and it's going to be pushing through change in the region in every shape or form throughout our economies and societies for the foreseeable future. And second of all, for the Middle East itself, we see rival supply, chiefly from the US in terms of both oil and gas, and this has really reworked the energy map. It's taken some power from OPEC. It's delivered a big challenge there. We're seeing, for exporters, gas exporters, the US is going to be a major rival sort of supply, and I think all producers are going to have to adjust their policies and have a big impact on price. And finally, geopolitics. The region's been in turmoil. It's never been a calm place, the Middle East, certainly since I was born and quite a while before that. But I think we'll all agree that things have gone up. The mercury has risen quite a few notches in the last few years, since 2011. And since President Trump has come on board, we're seeing yet a new level of potential disruption coming on the scene. We just have to look at the news yesterday with these tankers, and there's no doubt this has had an impact on the energy project. Big projects such as Total's Yemen LNG has been knocked out. It affects sentiment all through the region, but I'm sure our participants can say a bit more about this. So having said that, I'd like to kick off, and maybe with Sheikh Ali, I'll throw you sort of a bigger octopus of a question. Having laid out the problems, what sort of policies do you think can be introduced to counter them in terms of boosting energy governance, how revenues can be better spent? Where do you see the role of, firstly, government itself, the private sector, and international organizations? Sheikh Ali.
أولا وقبل كل شيء صباح الخير لجميع في بيروت وفي هذا المؤتمر، وخاصة معالي الرئيس الشيخ أمين، وطبعا روبير سوسو ورجاء سيداو والجميع اللي موجودين، ولا أستطيع أن أذكرهم جميعا. هل الكلام يكون في الإنجليزي ولا العربي؟ اللي تفضلوا.
English probably would be best, but certainly Arabic, I think everyone's got translation. It's up to you, sir. Whatever you feel most comfortable in.
I think we have been blessed by many resources. However, we have not been very wise in using them in the past 30 or 40 years. We have wasted a lot of these resources in visions, whether these visions were political, religious, or economic. Of our leaders. In my view, visions are given to profit, not to us mortals. The big thing that we the basic thing we should consider using our is concentrating on our people. This is the biggest resource of all our countries. Giving them freedom to work, to develop, giving them the environment to be secure. This will result in the best economic development rather than coming from the top. If we follow these recommendations and concentrate on our people and concentrate on creating a stable environment, and that stable environment cannot be with a lot of our population living near the subsistence level.
Thank you, Sheikh Ali.
Now, if we look at the current situation of the gas in the Mediterranean, it affects two countries, Lebanon and Egypt. In both these countries, the people are extremely hard workers and entrepreneurial. And these people, if you take Lebanon, there are more Lebanese outside Lebanon than in Lebanon, which is an indication of how much of an entrepreneurial nation they are. So if we can use, in Egypt, there are at least 7 to 8 million Egyptians outside Egypt working in the Gulf or Europe.
Yeah, thank you, Sheikh Ali. Radia.
If these people are given the security and to feel that their saving and earning are safe in their own country. If in Egypt, every Egyptian spends $3,000 a year, that would be more than the income from the Suez Canal, from petroleum. So in essence, our recommendation to use these to provide infrastructure, especially in terms of education and medical care, and to elevate the disparity of income among various groups in our society, at least not to allow people to be near starving level. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikh Ali. Radia, I was wondering if we can have some input from you. You brought up wasted resources. How do you see the region better enabling itself to prevent this?
Thank you very much. First of all, Excellencies, thank you very much for the invitation for this panel, and always, I would say, interesting to have eminent speakers at this panel. You indicated the energy security and the kind of policy that we need to have in terms of management of natural resources. I will just stop on the definition of the energy security first, because I don't think anymore it's relevant as a concept. We much more today talk about the sustainability of energy system that is beyond just what is needed for the current generation, but for the future generation. And specifically for the Middle East region, I would say this is one of the most fascinating regions I would work in, because you have really a multifaceted vulnerability in this region. But at the same time, you have plenty of resources that are not equally distributed. And basically, the multifaceted vulnerability, it doesn't matter whether the resources in terms of oil and gas are plenty available and used for the energy access, for the economic development. We are not talking about oil and gas producers versus consumers. Much more that the sustainable business model, I would say, that we have today is not anymore sustainable, because we have a region that has water scarcity, land degradation, you have growing population, and you have young population that need to give them jobs and so on, plus the impact of climate change. And I would say that we do have a lot of things to say during this panel. But in addition to that we develop a business model that is not sustainable in terms of production and consumption of energy. And for this, one of the key elements that you indicated is the good governance. And basically, in absence of good governance and the availability of quality of the institutions, so whatever policy that you put in place, you could not achieve the results. Talking about the good governance and the quality of the institutions, when we have them in place, so basically you move for the best management of natural resources, and you would move obviously to much more productive activities that you can put in your country. So for the Middle East region as well, we do have, I would say, another aspect that is missing in somehow. It's a regional cooperation that needs to be considered in terms of natural resource management. And we will talk about the other session in terms of the natural gas resources and the development in the region. And one of the critical elements in terms of governance as well, it's to look at this aspect. So in terms of proactive policies that need to be put in place, I would say first we need to have the good governance, and this not only in terms of looking at the aspect of corruption and things like that, but more importantly is to build the capacity of government institutions that's still lacking in all the aspects, plus building the capacity of the institutions to put in place the right policies. And for this, we need to boost energy efficiency, renewable energy, but more importantly, to move to energy productivity that would help to have much more productive sectors, not only from oil and gas producing countries, but also importing countries.
Saroj, any thoughts here?
I think first of all, very happy to be here. This is my first visit to this part of Lebanon, and it's so beautiful. And thank you very much, Excellency the President, and also the Prime Minister, to see you both here. It's an amazing gathering, and I think the topic is extremely relevant and something very close to my heart as well. And I'll come to this point in a minute as to why it is so important. The energy today for our countries, both countries which are very rich in hydrocarbon resources and those who are not, both these countries have highest fiscal risk coming from the energy sector. It's very difficult to believe that countries which are rich in hydrocarbon also have highest risk coming from the energy sector. If you look at the total public debt in our countries, both hydrocarbon rich and those who are not, you'll find that anywhere from 10% to 30% to 36% of public debt is in the energy sector. State-owned companies, energy utilities, sometimes Ministry of Finance borrowing it and on lending it to the energy utility. That's the size of public debt you are, where the overall fiscal sustainability of the state, the sovereign, is at question. You have countries in this region which have the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. How can this happen? So I think it's very important to look at the context of energy security with the broader sustainability of the state as such and the sovereign functions they have to perform. The second point I want to make is that the challenge of looking at the energy security, I think the point that was made by my colleague on the panel, that looking at the issues of a longer-term perspective on the security, looking at the issues of sustainability and the regional cooperation. These are great points, I think. My question today is that why are the governments of today in these countries not prioritizing addressing the fundamental issues that are involved on the three elements that were just raised? And I think the reason for this is essentially there's always this expectation that my problem is not because of me. My problem is always because of external reasons. I'm not responsible for what's happening in my country. And I think that has to go away. It is because fundamentally the energy sector is not being managed well by the governments of our times. And they got to make it a priority, and they got to deal with this first as a national priority, as an issue of emergency, and start dealing with this, and then see how others can cooperate. It cannot be that we completely want to outsource this to other governments and other organizations and regional bodies to help deal with this. Thank you.
Dr. Ahmed, do you take this point about not taking ownership of the problem? Do you feel that's fair? And I'd also be interested to hear what you have about the role of private sector government.
Thank you very much, Rafiq. First of all, أود أن أعبر عن سعادتي بوجودي في هذا المحفل الهام، وأشكر فخامة الرئيس أمين جميل على الدعوة الكريمة للمؤسسة العربية للاستثمارات البترولية أبي كورب، والصديق العزيز روبير سورسو، أن تكون في هذا المحفل المهم وتناقش أحد أهم قضايا الساعة التي تؤثر تأثير مباشر على هذه المنطقة وشعوبها. وأود أن أعبر عن سعادتي بوجودي في هذا مع الزملاء الكرام، وتحية خاصة إلى معالي الشيخ علي الخليفة الصباح، أحد رواد الصناعة النفطية العربية في الزمن الجميل. Thank you, Rafiq, for the question. I do agree that the region is going through an unprecedented transformation in the energy sector, both importing countries and exporting countries. I always say that I take Saudi Arabia, where I work, as an example. 4 or 5 years ago, 7 years ago maybe, when the world renewable energy was mentioned, Saudi Arabia would resist. And this is not a secret, and they admitted themselves. Look where they are now as far as embracing the change in the energy transition that has dictated policies and strategies and financing options on all these countries. I would like to focus, to answer your question, on the angle of the private sector in this transition. I spent 18 years at the IFC, and I'm a firm believer of the role of the private sector in establishing a key role in implementing this energy transition and diversification that the region is going through. APICORP publishes an annual energy investment outlook. The latest was issued a few weeks ago. We have seen that the region will require $1 trillion of energy investments in the coming 5 years. Where is this going to come from? Saroj has just alluded to the fiscal implications that are burdening the economies of the region. That's why the role of the private sector becomes important, and we have seen some success stories in that regard. Take Egypt and Jordan and Morocco in the renewable energy space. They have prepared the conducive environment for the private sector and the investors to come, and they have come. I myself covered the Jordan experience in my previous job, where when the conducive environment for investors in the renewable energy was prepared, results have happened. That said, and I will close, I think the challenges for the rest of the region is still huge. I think embracing economic diversification is still in its early stage. I think, however, all countries have realized that need. We are in the great country of Lebanon. Lebanon has a long way to go still in this regard, in terms of putting the seeds for a regulatory and an investment framework that can bring financing and investments to help in this vital sector, as I said, to the region as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. We've heard some pretty well laid out challenges, and they're daunting. And these challenges come at the same time as we're seeing sort of rival supply coming in and cutting prices, both on oil and gas. And in gas, we're going to face a big wave of US LNG coming. Just a few years ago, on the oil side, people thought that $100 oil was going to stay forever. We now know that to be a complete fiction. Similarly, there's going to be pressure on the gas environment. Is going to change. I'd be very interested to hear from some of our participants today. How do you see the region LNG sector, especially with reference to Lebanon and its efforts on LNG? How do you see it best responding to the challenge from this new rival supply? And David, we haven't heard from you.
Well, thank you, and let me echo thank you to the Maison du Futur and everyone who's been responsible for putting together this gathering. It's great to be in such a beautiful location, and it's great to be somewhere that stands at the start of its gas journey, filled with hope and not yet jaundiced by the cruel reality of a world that has a lot of gas. If you'd gone back 10 years, in this particular region, Egypt was a story of managed decline. Everybody else in the region was unaware yet of the bounty that may lie beneath their territories. So first, the bad news. There's a lot of gas, and just because you've got gas locally doesn't mean that that's what's going to get developed. In fact, the history of the gas industry over the last 30 years is that the most obvious gas resource to be developed is typically not the one that gets developed first. And I think it's only about a decade ago that an LNG tanker came all the way from Sakhalin Island, past 20 other LNG liquefaction plants, and arrived in Kuwait. How on earth could that happen with Qatar, with Iran, with Indonesia, with you name it, the number of places with enormous gas resources that were nearer and cheaper than Sakhalin Island, and yet Kuwait bought LNG from Russia. So first, proximity doesn't buy you anything. The second thing is that the gas industry is still at a stage where it doesn't have the fungibility that the oil industry has. And so risk is an important factor. If you are not the lowest risk supply, look at what Asia is prepared to pay for LNG compared to Europe or America, and you will see the premium that people are prepared to pay for reliability. So American LNG is a very interesting change of paradigm, because in most of the world, gas is priced and bought as a substitute for oil, or for oil equivalent type fuels. In America, gas competes against other gas and is bought as, is this the cheapest gas available? And that puts a cap on the price of American gas, which means that for as long as there is an arbitrage and gas can be produced in America for less than customers are prepared to pay in this region, North American LNG will flow to wherever people are prepared to buy it. And there is a lot of capital in America. There's a lot of capability in America. And there is a desire politically to extend American influence through its global energy engagement. So if I was sitting in Lebanon, I would be remembering a story that when my children were young, they used to think was hugely funny, which is, where does an 800-pound gorilla sleep? And the answer is wherever an 800-pound gorilla wants to sleep. Lebanon is not yet an 800-pound gorilla. It is, in gas terms, and I hope this translates better in Arabic than in English, in gas terms, Lebanon is a baby chimpanzee that has to look at the 800-pound gorillas all around it and sleep wherever they're not. And that is the challenge that I know we will discuss a lot today, which is, how do you make sure that you survive through childhood and adolescence in gas market terms to become one of the players in the global industry? How do you avoid members of your own troop in your own region from suppressing your growth? But how do you also survive in a global industry which, as I say, has a lot of gas?
Thank you. Yeah, and just to stress, I took some time last week to look at what the US has done, and you look at the graph, and it's just quite astonishing. Literally, quarter and quarter last year to various Asian countries, US oil exports just are like that. So it's a threat to be ignored at your peril. Hisham, you are one of the architects, certainly been very involved in a regional gas success story. Egypt just a few years ago was in crisis. It invested, a lot of money being invested in some LNG export terminals, and there wasn't enough gas to feed both them and the domestic market. Everything was going south. It's really turned that around, and part of that story is BP. We'd like to hear from you.
Thanks a lot. بس في الأول أحب أقول إن أنا يشرفني ويسعدني إن أنا أكون موجود النهاردة في هذا المنتدى بصفتي العملية، بصفتي بشتغل في BP، بس بصفتي الشخصية. وبرضه يسعدني إن أنا هكون مشارك إن شاء الله في الجزء بعد الظهر إن شاء الله في السيشن اللي على مصر. I'll switch to English to answer your question. I think you mentioned US, and if you look at the US last year, the growth in gas production and oil production in the US last year was the fastest ever any country have delivered in 1 year. So, and it's mainly driven by shale. So shale is live, shale is kicking, shale is there, and it's definitely part of the equation for the future. If we specifically talk about LNG, last 20 years tripled in size. Expectations the next 20 years it will almost double, maybe more than double. But as I think was said before, there is lots of oversupply. We've seen last year almost a match between growth in supply and demand, but we already last few months in 2019, we've seen demand going down in Asia. We've seen prices go down. The differential between Europe and Asia almost diminished over the last few months. And we've seen storage going up. And I think for the first time, we're seeing a risk of a meaningful curtailment of gas supplies. We've seen curtailment minor ones before. I think now, because of the oversupply, they could be going through a challenge of a major curtailment. This means what? Means who will win, who will be standing at the end, whoever will be cheaper, and delivering this gas in a mostly environmentally friendly way. So that's the name of the game. It applies to LNG. It also applies to pipeline, because as we all know, LNG will compete with pipeline, and pipeline we have a big supplier, which is Russia. And again, how Russia protects its market share, how cheap the development of gas resources and the transportation of gas resources will evolve over the next years will name who will win and who will lose in the future.
Thank you. Right. So at the same time as we have some oversupply, there's also a need for investment, big need. And the IEA, International Energy Agency, has been calling out that we do face a crunch coming up if we don't see more dollars put in. I was wondering how, in this new environment, investors position themselves. Does the Middle East, does it still offer the same attractions as it did pre-shale? How can host countries do to improve themselves? Hisham, let's continue with you.
I think because I lived the Egypt experience, I've been running North Africa and Egypt for almost 20 years now for BP. And I think one of the things BP have done, which I think, again, it's a source of pride now, given we went through the journey, is despite 2010, 2011, we all know what Egypt was going through a lot of turmoil, lots of change, and we've made a decision at the board level that because we've been in Egypt for more than 50 years, we know that there were lots of potential in resources. We know that we're there in the long term. I think one of your questions is our business is a long-term business. We have to look at the long term. And some other companies were pulling out or stopping or slowing down. We've decided to invest $10 billion in Egypt. This is 2010, 2011, and I had to go to the board to get this approval. And I remember that the decision was made on quality resources. We're there for the long term. It's economic. It makes sense. And we know that this period we're going to pass out of it because we've been there. We've seen a lot in many countries over many years. So and now I think the results, as you know, I mean, Egypt went from a massive, probably one of the largest LNG importers in the world, to, as of the last few months, exporting gas and with still great potential. So I think it's commitment, it's a partnership which we need to happen. It has to be a win-win with governments and IOCs. And we have to stay with it, and stay with it for the long term, not just dealing with short-term issues.
Thank you. Siraj, you...
Yes, I'm compelled to come in at this stage because, first of all, we are looking at the region which is very diverse in terms of many factors, but particularly on investment climate. And your question is that, are the investors really coming to these countries? Do they feel secure? Do they feel comfortable in terms of the returns? Our own analysis shows that the overall, across the Middle East, there's a decline in terms of the foreign direct investment. The investment climate in these countries are going from bad to worse. The risk for the investors is much higher today. At the same time, what you're experiencing is a very different trend where the governments in power get into bilateral deals. Often they come with long-term liabilities for the countries. I won't name the countries and the contracts here that are currently under review through various mechanisms because of the fiscal liability for the country. And then you suddenly discover that these deals and contracts signed many years ago, for various reasons. I'm not questioning anyone's integrity and the intention, but the fact it could be because of change in technology, it could be because of other sources of energy have come in, but it could also be because there was not an open, competitive, inclusive process in how these contracts and investments are managed. So broadly, the whole value chain of investment in the region, in my view, needs a lot of work. I think the Middle East, in my view, is not yet open for business. Business, in a sense of the term, what the World Economic Forum would say, a competitive business environment for countries to attract more investment internally and also from external environments. Thank you.
Can I just interrupt? Do those points pertain specifically to the energy sector?
Yes, it does. It does. Because if you really look at currently, I made this point before, the fiscal risks. If you currently look at the government's fiscal liabilities of countries in the region, and I made this point before, when I said public debt and publicly guaranteed debt, both, when the government signed a contract with any investor, the government basically is taking a lot of risks these days. And the governments, when they take these risks, somebody has to pay for it in the long run because the risk will materialize. And are these contracts being done in a manner where there's a proper risk sharing between the investor and the government? These things we need to look at. Not all contracts are the same, but some contracts are definitely not designed in a way to support the country. It might serve the interest of few people in the government then. And this is the point I'm making, that it's very important to look at the whole investment climate from a perspective where there's more transparency, there's more competition, and there is a better regulation in the country for these investments. That is the foundation first we have in the countries before we really talk about attracting new investments.
Thank you, Doctor.
I just want to complement the answer of Mr. Hisham on the IOCs to talk about the NOCs in our region, the national oil companies. I think one has to look at them very, very carefully. I think they are also embracing the changes. Take the 2017 ADNOC issuance, bond issuance. Take the 2019, this year, Aramco bond issuance. I think the capital structure of how the NOCs are financing these investments is no longer only dependent on equity from the government. So I think to complement the role of the IOCs, the NOCs in the region are also starting to change their priorities and business model in terms of attracting new investments.
Thank you. Sheikh Ali, if you can hear me in Kuwait. I've studied Iraq, and I've noticed both Iraq and Kuwait, sometimes democracy has been an impediment to oil investment. certainly foreign oil investment. I'd like your take in terms of both how it impacts Kuwait and the wider region. Your views on how we can kickstart investment and the right sort of investment.
أولاً please allow me to say one thing. I fully agree that to attract investment, we have to provide an environment for it. Development, positive development, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and in the 60s, 70s, if you remember, everybody would think that these natural resources have to be developed by the natural.
Have a problem. Yeah.
If we just go with the audio.
Yeah.
Audio, yeah. Somebody can call him by phone and just.
If we just go with the audio.
That thing the best companies with the best technology and the best management. However, there is still residue. Something that the state can do more by that are not based on 100% economic thinking.
I'm sorry, Sheikh Ali.
And also sometimes, and for example, what happened in Egypt in the 1912 during the disturbances, where the oil companies were not paid their dues. This, of course, frightens oil companies. This frightens the investors. We have to provide the investors.
Thank you.
They can, if they invest, they can get the rewards that are their due the countries. And I don't think any of these oil companies, international companies, are here to exploit. They are here to invest. I don't think there will be a lack of investment in our area. So what we should do is ensure to the international investors and investors, the local investors, invest.
I'm sorry, Sheikh Ali. I think the line has gone a bit. I do apologise, but we'll try and return to.
They can get their money out
to you.
They can get their reward out. Do that. There is not going to be a lack of investment in this area. But if we think that we are smarter, we can legislate somehow and take their reward, their effort and their money. And if we do only one or two of these things, that is sufficient to discourage investment in our area.
Thank you.
I encourage the countries
Thank you. I apologise for that. David, have you got any thoughts?
What I want to pick up the point that Sheikh Ali was making, as well as others, because in the end, investors are interested in one thing and one thing only: can I earn a return that is commensurate with the risk that I'm taking? That requires a change of mindset from host governments on their resources, because there is undoubtedly rent in oil, which allows them to have a discussion about what share of that rent they're going to take, whether it's directly through the fiscal terms or it's through other things like local content obligations or market prices in domestic markets. But at the other end of the spectrum, there is no rent in renewables. And I think that what I've seen in the region is governments haven't yet got their mind around the idea there is no rent in renewables, that investment is not going to come unless the climate for doing business is made sufficiently attractive that the frictions, and Saraja, you said, I'm not suggesting for a moment that there was corruption or anything else, and then he said there were terms that might have suited people who were in power at the time, which sounds to me an awful lot like corruption. And undoubtedly there's a spectrum in that. But with renewables, the lack of rent means that there is no adjustment down the road available from government reducing its take from the project, because once it's done, it's done. Gas, interestingly, has historically had some rent in it, but probably going forward will have no rent in it. And so underpinning gas development, if people get too hung up on what's the national share of this great bounty, then they will be cruelly disappointed when they discover how little rent there is in gas. So that's the first point I'd make, which is the investment environment has to reflect the reality of the value of the resource and the rent in the resource, and not overplaying the hand. The second point I would make is that if you remember nothing else from today, I want you to remember this sentence. Mutual interdependence is the surest path to prosperity and peace. And for as long as people are focused on how do I make sure I maximize my share of the resource that I think I've got, how do I argue about whether a maritime border is 2 yards this way or 2 yards that way, and if I couple that with what I've just said, that there isn't really any rent in these resources, the real value is in getting the resources developed so that then you have low-cost energy coming into your economies. And back to what Sarah said about fiscal liability from the energy sector, it is the electricity sector, particularly, that is crushing the economies of this region, because governments have given electricity to their populations as a way of buying compliance for less than it costs to provide that electricity. And one of the best ways of making sure that the subsidy that is implied in that and the fiscal liability that is implied in that is by getting low-cost gas in to support your electricity sectors. And this is something that Egypt is starting to recognize, and it's something that other countries in the region need to recognize. If you can do that and get the investment flowing and focus on the value you get from consuming low-cost gas that is produced at the lowest cost by reducing the risk, you will get far more value from that, and you will get far more investment into the sector than if you try and scrabble over who owns how much of what resource and what's that resource worth in terms of being able to squeeze a little bit of extra rent. That's really the big investment story.
A great point, and very opposite for Lebanon. Radia, your thoughts on the investment?
Yeah, actually, I just want to compliment what David said. I mean, I would rather describe the natural gas compared to oil. It's like marriage compared to dating. And usually, like natural gas, you cannot dissociate from geopolitics. And that's why when we were working with David on the long-term scenarios back in IHS, one of the scenarios, and the one realistic that I see when I see the collaboration between Saudi Arabia and Russia, I see the acquisition done in between. I see also how within the region, I would say, including between China and Russia, I see much more strategic scenario that's leading. A strategic scenario, it means that you accept, as indicated, it's not just looking for the IUCs. Gas will remain as a strategic asset and will remain as a strategic in terms of investment, and the NOCs will be leading in terms of investment. Maybe in certain countries, like if we talk about Lebanon, but in the GCC, certainly the NOCs will play a major role. But what I want to indicate that, on the critical element that I want to add, that for natural gas within the Middle East region, if we don't have a regional market, then certainly we will not be able to take the benefit of that. And certainly with the friction and the geopolitics in there, this would be extremely difficult. But I see Egypt taking the lead on that. The domestic market is really promising. And I think collaboration, at least between the Arab countries in the region, would give, I would say, much result for all and a benefit as well. But at the end of the day, also one of the critical elements, and David maybe indicated that there is a lack, I would say, that it's the price that will define. But the competition price, yes, we will see in the future that the gas markets will change in terms of pricing mechanism. It started already. But within this region, in absence of regional markets, we will see that the LNG market will not be as much liquids, and and basically the pipeline will still prevail. And that's why I would say the strategic solutions and partnership should be the strategic solution to be taken.
Thank you, thank you. I think this point that the regional markets can be taken up later in the day, but it's absolutely central, especially for Lebanon. Okay, quickly, let's move on to climate change. You know, the demand's growing. At the same time, we got to get the greenhouse emissions down. How does the region specifically need to respond to this? You know, in terms of whether it be subsidies, energy efficiency, renewables. Hisham, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, if you reflect last year, just what happened in the globe, and maybe we can then take it down to the region, because last year was an interesting year. And as we all know, the world needs more energy, but also we need to do this with less carbon. So last year we've seen unprecedented growth in energy demand for the world, 2.9%. Just to put numbers in perspective, this is double the growth for the average last year. So this is a massive change, not a small change. But also, as a result, we've seen an increase in emission by 2%, which is the largest increase we've seen in 1 year over the last 7 years. So I think this year was a year of mismatch, or a year of bigger gaps between what the world needs, which is less emissions, but also the progress we're all making to reach this. And I think we all know the later we bring emissions down, that means it will be harder. It will also be more costly. It costs us more. So the sooner we do this, I think, the better. So and you look at the mix of why is this happening. I think David mentioned power. Power is a big drive of this, because power grew even faster, bigger than energy. Power grew by 3.4% last year. How did the world meet this growth? 1/3 came from renewables, which is good. We need more renewables. We need to keep pushing for renewables. But 1/3 came from coal, which is not good. So for the second year in a row, we've seen coal production increasing across the world. Why? Because China and Asia, they're growing their renewables by 25% every year, especially China and India. But they need more power, they need more energy, and they moved to go to coal as a balance to meet this energy demand. So this race for renewables, I think, is important, but I think the race should be for lower carbon emissions. So we need all sorts of fuels. We need all sorts of technologies to deliver this. So back to the regions, I think it's what applies to the world applies to the regions. We need all sorts of fuels. We need to use technology, carbon storage, mixing it with hydrogen, bringing more efficiency for what we're producing now. Because what we're producing now, I think there's a potential to bring it down by 30 to 40%. This means every molecule of energy produced now could be done with less, 30, 40%, which means what? It means less carbon in the air. So more efficiency of what we're producing now, zero tolerance for the future for new projects, for, again, identifying and creating new products which has less intensity to generate carbon in the air. So I think the region needs to work on this. We have the oil and gas, by the way, is still part of the mix. It will continue to be part of the mix. Let's not pretend in 20, 30 years. Well, in 20 years, oil and gas will be probably 40, 50% of the energy the world needs. So we need to produce oil and gas efficiently, safely, and with less emissions. But also we need to drive new technologies to bring down emissions, especially from gas, as I said, with lots of technologies. So there's a sense of urgency in the world, and I think we should have the same sense of urgency here in the region, because we're part of the world and we're part of the solution, and we could be part of the problem. Thank you.
Dr. Ahmed.
Just to put some numbers also on the investment side of the climate change revolution, actually, that's happening, and the region has seen the starting of it. Of the $1 trillion US dollars investments in the next 5 years in the energy sector that we estimate the region needs, 36% of which is in the power sector. And within the power sector, more than 40% is in renewables. So this shows clearly where the investment direction is going as far as climate change policies to address these challenges. We have also seen many countries in the region have started to look into energy efficiency, smart grids, even price reforms. Oil-producing countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, have started price reforms in the energy sector that shows the seriousness with which they're taking the diversification and the climate change challenges on board.
So maybe this will be my last intervention, so I need to say a few things, including on climate change. First of all, I think from a World Bank Group perspective in this region, in the Middle East, we have three priorities. First, make sure that energy sector does not add to the existing fiscal burden on the countries. And as I said, most of these countries have very limited fiscal space to manage their public services, core public service functions. So it's very important that energy sector does not add to the existing large debt burden in the countries. Second, make sure that we support the countries to develop a more financially sustainable energy sector strategy in the countries. And this is where renewable comes in big time. And we've seen a big change happening in the region. Jordan is definitely a shining star in terms of what they have achieved in bringing, and Ahmad Bin was part of the IFC team. And we continue to work on this, and they have made tremendous progress on this. As we speak, we're already looking at a very big investment coming up in the energy storage, renewable energy storage. There's a big investment coming up in the country. Lebanon as well, I think, has embarked on a very ambitious electricity reform plan recently passed by the parliament, and we are very excited about it. Of course, it is not a perfect plan. You always need a few things to be added here and there. I don't think there's any country in the world which has ever produced a perfect electricity reform plan. It is not possible.
California.
Well, we can talk about California. So I think more work needs to be done. We would like to support the government, take it forward, because Lebanon cannot afford not to implement a reform plan with a great sense of urgency. And we can see that, and we are very supportive, and we will support the government to take it forward. Thirdly, I think linking broadly to the climate change, I do want to emphasize the broader energy, water, and food nexus. And I found one of the co-organizers in this group, Medurable.
Yes.
I would like to follow up with them, because this is something, again, we are very keen to build an energy, water, food platform in this region, bringing the countries in Tigris, Euphrates, Jordan Valley together. Regional cooperation, people say it is not possible, and I say it is possible. Regional cooperation is happening. Those of you who believe it's not happening, it's not correct. There are regional cooperation happening in a different scale. You talked about Egypt playing that bigger role, which is happening. We see Iraq, Jordan coming together for energy trade. Now, Jordan has reached out to Lebanon to export energy, because Jordan has surplus energy, and there is already some discussion happening between the two governments. So I think all that we need to do is to support these countries to find various ways. Despite all the challenges in the region, we want to be part of the solution, we all. And the last thing I want to say is making sure there is absolute transparency and accountability in the way this whole process is managed, both by the government and by the businesses. The responsibility is on both sides. And I think it is important that we bear that in mind, because this has not been the case for long in this region. And this applies to both domestic private sector as well as to the international private sector. Thank you very much.
Nadia, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say that this year, it's the year where we'll have the Climate Change Summit in September, and at the High-Level Political Forum in July next month. The main indicator that will be considered is the climate change number 13. However, when last week I was in New York at the midterm review of the UN Decade for Sustainable Energy for All, it's not the Middle East region, or let's say the Western Asia region, that is not in track. It's the global, worldwide. No one is on track of sustainable energy, and no one is on track in terms of climate change. But I would rather take the defensive position compared to my colleagues, because as coming from the UN system, and specifically for the Middle East region, we don't want to represent that we are implementing a mitigation solution when we are much more impacted in terms of climate change. So the adaptation should prevail before talking about mitigation. And for the mitigation, we need to have the international finance and the access to technology, specifically not only from the energy perspective in terms of energy efficiency, renewable energy, cross-economic sectors, but more importantly in terms of cleaning the fossil fuels. And I still believe that fossil fuel needs additional investment. If you're talking about the IUCs investing in the region, so they need to invest on the technology they may have or they are working on the research in order to clean fossil fuel at the production and not to put a carbon price at the consumer level, because at the end of the day, whether we are, I would say, the current oil and gas producing countries in the Middle East or those upcoming, hopefully, Lebanon, for example, why we should, when we have resources for developing our nation and to have better life for our future generation, we should pay as well the tax for the consumers who polluted the world. So basically, these are an important aspect, and I was happy that we have a session that look at the dimension of the water energy nexus versus sustainable energy. And one of the critical elements of adaptation cross-mitigation is the nexus in a way that's oil and gas resources. And I'm saying this for those who are already in place as oil and gas producing countries like the GCC, where when we produce 1 barrel of oil, we have 9 barrels of water. And this water is not properly processed, and there is not enough technologies in order to show its use. So basically, we start from this, and then we talk about the mitigation measures. For this, you need to have the technology, and you need to have the adequate finance to deal with.
Thank you. David.
I just wanted to your question was, what should this region be doing in terms of climate change and clean energy investment? And this region can be a leader. What do I mean by that? What we know is that 20, 30 years from now, the energy system is going to have low carbon emissions. It may be because of renewable energy technologies. It may be because of the mitigation of emissions through carbon capture and reuse in some form. But what we know is that the end state is going to be a clean energy system. However, to get to that clean energy system 30 years from now, we need the incumbent and legacy energy systems to continue to receive huge investments. Again, my children are a source of inspiration. My son went out for a date with his girlfriend, and he said to her that since they were both going off to university, he thought they'd probably break up in 6 months' time. What he didn't realize was that he was breaking up in 6 seconds' time. By speculating about a future breakup, he had brought the event forward to today. The challenge for the Middle East is to lay out a path over the next 30 years that encourages the incumbent energy sector not to break up with it today, but to continue to provide the services and the energy resources that support economic growth and wealth creation in this region, but to have a clear path to how they are going to be sustainable economically through that transition. And that's something which California hasn't achieved. With the greatest respect, the Energiewende has not achieved that idea of making sure that we have a smooth transition, and we only have to look at the bankruptcy of most of the German utilities through that process. That was a rough period for shareholders in energy investors, and it meant that there was an awful lot of disruption and dislocation. The future, the good news is Germany learns from its past errors. Its football team is much better than it was at the last World Cup. Expect them to win the next one. But that really is the challenge, and the Middle East and this region could be a global leader in mapping out a sustainable economic path for the transition, knowing that today it's a predominantly fossil fuel environment, and in the future it's going to be a clean energy. How do we make sure that we get there without inadvertently breaking up with investors in the meantime?
I would say that it's a picture paradox in the Middle East. You have some of the least energy efficient groups out there, and at the same time the region's spearheading low-cost solar. Hichem, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts and maybe how you see the energy mix developing going forward.
I mean, the energy mix will change in the future, but I think, as I said before, Rafiq, as important as the mix changing is to look at what we're producing today and make it more efficient and make it with less emissions. I think that's So it's not a race to just renewables, it's just a race to lower emissions. I think we need both. And this applies to our region here. And if you look at this transition and this mix, I think the biggest challenge, in my view, we'll face as we're dealing with this dual challenge of more energy and less emissions will be how to decarbonize the power system. While we do this, while meeting the needs, the increased needs of power across the world, especially in developing countries like ours, because people are moving as we go through the next 10, 20 years. The population is growing. Between now and 20 years from now, the population of the world will grow by 1/3. But as important, 1/3 of this population will go from lower class to middle class, which means they need more power. And that's why we need to make sure this power, we focus now our energy to decarbonize this power, because that's probably the biggest challenge we have. What we do in the region here, I think we should take the lead on this. I think back to David's point, because if we know one thing, when you know a challenge ahead of time, you can deal with it versus waiting until someone else does it for us. Because I think, as I said before, we need everyone to work to deliver this. We cannot rely on governments, IOCs, or NGOs to do this. We have to work together. So the mix will change. Renewables will continue to grow. But again, as I said, the oil and gas will be part of this mix for the future, and it will be a big part of the future. So how we produce it, how we develop it, versus just assuming it will go away, because it will stay with us. But I think we should focus in technologies that allow us to get this cheaper and allow the investments to be economic for both governments and investors to invest in.
Thank you very much. That was great. Lots of interesting food for thought. It's a pity we seem to have lost Kuwait. I was hoping to ask Sheikh Ali about how he saw OPEC going forward. But let's take this to the floor. We'll be interested. Great to have some questions from you. Please state your name and affiliation if you have any questions. Yeah.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you for very interesting presentations and thoughts. My name is Rana Samaha. I'm with Energy Intelligence. I had a question for Mr. Makawi, and I'd like everyone to give their thoughts. You said that you are seeing in the future an oversupply of natural gas, and you're saying that the cheapest gas is probably the one that will reach the market. With that in mind, where do you see the East Med gas in terms of competitiveness when we look at what's going on in North America and obviously with Russian gas, so pipeline gas? So where do we sit?
I think the issue will be how competitive this gas will be, and some of the markets, as you know, in our region, the domestic markets are huge. So again, the competition will be with exports. Again, you have to be more cost effective, more efficient, and when we start exporting gas, it has to compete. So I think the issue comes again, cost. Our region again is geographically is blessed by God to be in the right place, because we have an East Med which has lots of gas available, and I think more gas to come. And hopefully when we come next year, inshallah, if we're invited, we celebrate success here in Lebanon. So there's lots of supply, but also we have proximity to markets, Europe, which is, again, needs gas. Of course, there's competition with pipeline gas. So the name of the game will be, again, security of supply and cost of supply. And I think that's what should be our focus now. And that's not just good when prices are high. It's good for all seasons, because we've seen swings in gas prices and oil prices, as we know, and some of the long-term, I know I work Algeria too, and our long-term gas contracts with Europe are oil-based. So we cannot just rely on, again, a gift from outside for oil price. We have to work on this cost efficiency, competitiveness, day in, day out, and then we'll be able to compete. And so far, I think our gas in the region is competitive in Europe, but it doesn't mean this will be forever.
I just want to add that at the end for the gas, it's the window. And the window till 2030 is already saturated. And I don't think The med gas, if it comes on stream before that, would find a market, even though if it's competitive. However, it will all depend on how much you will put it for the market. And the European market, in addition to the competition, there is another kind of competition, which is the energy efficiency. 11 billion cubic meters a year in the European market is declining because of the measures of energy efficiency. So for this need to be considered as well.
Just one observation on gas in the region. Historically, the MENA region was an LNG exporting area. It has now become one of the fastest LNG importing. This is interesting, particularly that the MENA region still has more than half of the world's gas resources. So eventually, gas will be a destination fuel, where all the technologies and the policies that will make it extracted cheaply and cleanly will give an advantage to those countries that do it.
Right, I've got one. Dr. Ahmed, again. You talked about the role of the private sector versus the NOCs. I see a contradiction in that in a lot of cases, the NOC is the best run organisation in the country. For instance, Aramco in Saudi Arabia. How do you see this process being managed, where you can get more private sector involvement, but at the same time retain those virtues that NOCs have been pushing?
The NOCs definitely will remain a key player in all of this. What I mentioned about the NOCs was in terms of the financing models. They're no longer relying only on governments or on their own resources. And I gave two examples. We have seen, again, I go back to our estimates, we have seen that non-governmental financed energy projects have risen by 22% year on year. So the role of the private sector, be it in terms of bringing the financing or, on the other hand, executing some of the energy projects, particularly in renewables, will continue to grow. And I think all countries have to embrace that. Public-private partnerships has proven to be a very good model to embrace this marriage between the private sector and governments in the energy sector. I heard that Lebanon has recently produced a PPP law that should also help this country in that direction. So there is no escape from giving the private sector a much larger role in the execution of this energy transition. This is exactly what I'm saying. Saroj has mentioned Jordan is a very good example. Egypt is an excellent example. And I think all countries have to continue on this path. There's no escape from it.
Thank you. Hisham, as an investor, give me 3 policies you want.
It has to be 3, yeah? Okay. Let me start with one. I think we talk about NOCs and the role of NOCs, and I think I agree that the role will continue. In some countries, this role sometimes gets mixed between an NOC playing dual role. So play the role of an investor and the role of a regulator. And that doesn't work. So my first thing would be, I think the countries which have done this divorce already, great. I know other countries are in the process of doing this resource, do it quickly. And the countries which are not, we're still keeping it, the quicker the better, because there is a conflict. So a regulator is a regulator and an investor is an investor, and it has to be aligned between them.
Sheikh Ali, welcome.
You want a second one?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Sheikh Ali. Sorry.
Sheikh Ali, welcome back. I do apologise for that. I wanted to hear your views on OPEC and how you see OPEC's role changing in this new environment.
I think the second thing is governments has to be flexible. And what I mean by flexible is sometimes we have, I think someone mentioned this already, old agreements which probably was good for the 90s, economic-wise, it's not good for now. And I'll just give you an example about the country I'm very familiar with, is Egypt. Egypt, over the last 4 years, we've negotiated every price in every concession, not just BP, in the country, sitting around the table with our partners and regulator, and open book. This is what will it take to make an investment. And this including Zohra, by the way, including West Nile Delta with BP, including Norris, which was a zero production, now producing a BCF. And the government was, again, ending in a win-win situation that unlocked billions of dollars of investments, which we could have been still talking about it now. And when the minister comes in the afternoon, he was leading this, and he takes lots of credit. He's not here with us now, I can say this. He's because, again, it takes leadership, it takes confidence, and then it creates lots of value for the governments.
Do you think it also takes a crisis?
Pardon me?
Do you think it also takes a crisis? I mean, Egypt, it also needs a crisis.
And absolutely. I mean, again, if you look at 5 years where we are 5 years now, I mean, all of this production, new production, comes from concession, which was negotiated day and night to get a win-win, and with a government which was willing to do this. I think that's important, because when it takes longer, it takes value from everyone.
Roj,
I gave you two. I think of a third one. Not two.
that was great.
My only point will be on this, the national oil companies. And again, I don't want to name a country. Now, there are cases where the national oil companies have really not helped better fiscal management of the hydrocarbon revenue, both oil and gas. And this has become also part of the problem. Yeah. So I think it's very important that the point that was being made earlier is that you have a clear firewall between the regulator, the investor, and the companies which are engaged in. So I think that system is important. So I think I would not like to subscribe to a general view that NOC is a good idea. NOC is a good idea, but 1, 2, 3, 4. And I think those systems need to be placed. And second, I do want to stress the point, something I have said before, is that this particular topic, energy, and within that oil and gas, and of course it applies to electricity as well, in terms of transparency and accountability, this sector is way behind. If you look at the broader global data for sector-wise transparency, this sector has to catch up. And I think we all in this room have an obligation, together with the governments, that we do a lot more to follow a very competitive, open, and inclusive process, because this is not happening. Even now I see in the countries, for example, gas to power, capture of the flared gas and how that can be used for power. There's a big market in the countries in the region. Where is that going? Are the governments willing to follow a competitive process? The answer is no, still. So I think there's some work to be done, and I think this should be part of our roadmap as we look forward. In addition to, of course, looking at how do we benefit from the new technology, how do we benefit more from regional cooperation, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor that have been provoked by that? Certainly, Fadal.
Thank you. My name is Massimo Marotti. I'm the Italian ambassador to Lebanon. I wonder, based on what you were saying about the condition of the market and of the industry in the region, do you think that the country in the region, the one who are already into the industry and market, the one who are looking forward to that, have an incentive today to start a regional understanding of cooperation, or this is too soon for the region to think in regional terms about how this market can be affecting both countries and clients, let's say?
I don't know, maybe I want to come in. Good to see you, Ambassador. I think there's one area where I think the League of Arab States, the World Bank Group, and I believe there are others involved under this Pan-Arab energy market. I think about 16 or 17 countries have signed up on this, and this is in place. And just before you came in, I was mentioning that Iraq and Jordan, through the same agreement, actually, Jordan is going to be able to export electricity to Iraq, and Jordan is now exploring the option of exporting energy to Lebanon. So there are these existing arrangements in place. All that we have to do is to help actually these mechanisms to work better, and where there are specific issues, and there are specific issues in the region, instead of making a very general view. And as you know, in the case of, let's say, for example, Jordan to export energy to Lebanon, we know the challenge is how do you basically work with the Syrian government in terms of that export, that trade to happen. So I think those issues will have to be dealt with. But there is a way out. I think there is a mechanism existing. The countries are coming together. They have signed up on this.
I'd just like to say on this front, of course, the region has taken a step backwards with this dispute with Qatar. You know, Qatar really should be providing pipe gas to Saudi Arabia. Could be doing a lot more, and it's not great. It's not great. David, have you any thoughts on this?
Well, I would say that opportunistic bilateral transactions are more likely to succeed than a grand vision that says somehow we're all in the same place, we should create this all-encompassing market. There's a really good reason why gas, even before the dispute, wasn't sent from Qatar to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a lot of gas. It had a price for gas that was below the price that Qatar could get for selling gas to other people. It's not a surprise that shouldn't have happened. So I would come back to what I told you have to remember. Mutual interdependence creates prosperity and peace. And so definitely more bilateral trade that begins to create an environment in which people could say, hey, that wasn't so bad, now we can put more than just a toe in the water. But I would say that in the same way as Britain and France are separated by 1,000 years of enmity, and yet we consider them to be close friends. We argue the most with the people that we're most alike, and therefore I'm a pessimist about the ability of this region because of the similarities between people, and yet they can identify what separates them rather than the broader similarity. And so until we can break that down, until we can make it about economics rather than about politics, until we can make it about a shared vision, I would say let's not think too much about the big deal. Let's think about the little individual things and build confidence from there.
But, yes, exactly. As the leader of an organisation,
exactly. Exactly, and I want to challenge David a bit, if you allow me, because you just said that if we are to move away from this conference taking one thing, it's mutual interdependence. So what you just answered contradicts that very good message that you gave us. I think the region has started historically on a very promising interrelated or interconnected energy schemes. The organization that I chair is one example, and I must say one successful example, where the 10 Arab oil producers came together and created an investment vehicle that has stood the test of time. And to answer the ambassador's question, I think the potential, however, of having this on a much grander scale was curtailed by the problems that we all know in the region, most recently in the Gulf, etc. So I do firmly believe that regional integration at all levels will definitely be much better than bilateral. The opportunistic view looks at the bilateral, but I think the potential of this region long term lies in the regional integration. Like you told us.
No, I totally agree with you. What I'm saying is that sometimes you have to have a few dates before you get married. It's about confidence building to get towards the vision that I agree with you entirely.
Yeah. And on that point, I think we have to bring it to a close. That was great. Thank you very much. Very appreciate all of you. Thank you for the audience. I do apologise to Sheikh Ali and to the problems on sound in Kuwait. Thank you. It's a pleasure.